Thank you for the opportunity to speak at today's conference, and I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land that we meet today. Just want to start with a quick overview of the work that we've been doing in the Kimberley, and the first sort of slide shows the four reserves where we spend a fair bit of time. Overall, we treat around almost 33,000 square kilometres in the Kimberley on conservation estate, a lot which we joint manage with traditional owners in the Kimberley. And the focus, and a lot of that 33,000 square kilometres is within those core reserves that are highlighted there. Last season, across the area, we treated about 9,000 square kilometres, which sort of is around the 28% of the total area that we were working in. And as you can see in those sort of graphs on the side there, like a lot of groups, we're seeing that sort of shift from late season fire to early season fire. In a lot of the reserves, a good sort of decrease in the total area burn, which I think is really important and what we're aiming for some of those biodiversity outcomes. But you can also see that not everywhere is having success every year, and Drysdale National Park is one of those where we've still got a little bit of work to do to get that fire management right, because we're not really getting the same sort of results as we're seeing in some of our other reserves. This graph's sort of a reflection of some of the progress I think that we're making, and some of it is the work that we're doing on the ground. Some of it is the seasons that we've had, and what Ian sort of described with the wetter seasons and the earlier onset. So while the last sort of 2 or 3 years look sort of very optimistic, we're not so naive to think that in the next couple of years we're not going to get some real challenges, and going to have to really work on our fire management in the next couple of seasons, just to make sure that we are sort of using that 20 to 30% of early season fire as strategically as we can to make sure we're making things easier for us later in the year. I wanted to spend the second part of our of what I'm talking about today on sort of some of our fire response. And as a department, we're a little bit late to the remote insertion, so the actual putting out of fires and the using of blowers, a lot of the people in this room have been doing it a lot longer than the department, and but as a government agency, we've now sort of progressed to using remote insertion, and I think getting some really good success. And in the last 2 years, we've initiated a Bambi bucket trial where we're actually using water in our suppression efforts across the Kimberley. We're also pairing that with a couple of sort of bits of early preparation to make sure we're ready and set up for the remote insertion and the firefighting efforts that we're putting in the late dry season. One part of that is these tactical maps where we're sort of identifying the cells we've made and the gaps that we have in those, and sort of working on a bit of a traffic light system of around sort of what's reasonable to contain, what we should put a response to, what topography is too hard to go in, and we've got a fallback to gaps to close. And so, doing that for those four reserves that I touched on earlier in the slides. The other one is the use of the high-res imagery. Rowan's work on the stopping features and across sort of the high rainfall area, and also the Sentinel moisture index sort of mapping, which, again, if we need to use Bambi buckets and we want to support our suppression efforts with water, we need to be able to find water in the landscape, and this high-res imagery has been really useful for identifying that water and then being able to move it towards the fire ground. When we're doing the sort of Bambi bucket works, we've got to have water within 5 nautical miles or 3 nautical miles or 5 kilometres, and preferably sort of less than 3 kilometres, so that turnaround time is actually supporting the suppression effort in the Savanna landscapes. I'll flick through the scenario because it's not overly useful, but yeah, this is just one example of where we actually had a bit of a win using suppression. And one I will draw you to is the actual bucket hole. So where we sort of got that water for that effort was identified through that central imagery. As you can see, it's quite a small but sort of deep water hole that allowed us to pour water and help the guys on the ground with the suppression. This year we actually had an aircraft on standby for 10 weeks from the end of September to the start of December. And that actually gave us the ability to go when we saw the hotspots coming up on NAFI and with the mapping that we've done previously, really knowing which ones we're leaving and watching which ones we're actually going to respond to as lightning sort of started coming through the landscape. The other thing that we're sort of using it for is some of that mop-up. So when you have stags or pandanus or other things sort of that are alight through the landscape, trying to put those out with blowers and trying to get an edge around them can be difficult. But yeah, with 800 to 1,000 litres of water, being able to drop that directly sort of on top of some of that, those things that are burning and potentially going to hop over sort of containment lines has been really useful for us into this season. The other thing is it's not really about putting water directly onto the fire. It's actually about sort of responding to and helping out those guys on the ground with the blowers. So we're sort of dropping the water in front of the fire, and then as the sort of fire behaviour sort of decreases, then we're using the blowers to put it out. So bamboo buckets don't work in the absence of people. We actually, those guys need to be, and girls need to be on the ground sort of doing that work. But it does sort of lower that fire behaviour and increase that small window that we've got sort of during the morning to sort of do some of that remote insertion work. So again, this is sort of just a quick video sort of showing the mopping up of an effectively a dead edge, but just sort of putting some water sort of along the vegetation that we've sort of done the blowing on, just to make sure we've got it sort of fully contained. And they've got a fair bit of control on sort of the release of the valve there to make sure they get a sort of good distribution sort of along the fire edge. Just another sort of brief video again. So we're showing us back off the fire edge, sort of putting it through the grass, and then as the fire sort of comes up to the wet edge, we can then sort of put that out with the blowers. The other one we've actually found it where we're stitching up some of those gaps in the landscape, and we have to put fire in to stitch that gap. Actually putting a wet edge in first and then working off that wet edge is actually giving us a lot more progress and making those operations where we're putting fire into the landscape a little bit safer. And so overall, 2022 was on balance a pretty reasonable season, and getting into the planning for 23, expecting that the end of this year could be a little bit challenging the last couple of three. Thank you.